Last week, Tuesday, I asked my daughter what she learned in school that day. And that's why we got to get in the habit of asking our kids every day, especially when they're young, what did they learn in school? I asked her what you learned in school, and she told me she learned about slavery. So I say, okay, what did you learn about slavery? These are her exact words. She said, I learned that black people were slaves to white people and that white people used to hate black people. That was the summarization in her mind of what she learned about slavery that day. And I had to immediately educate her, like, well, sweetie, it's not about hate, we're not slaves now. White people, they don't own slaves now, and in fact, all people had slaves. All different types of people had slaves back in the day. Because students in public schools in the U.S., the teachers focus on the curriculum, focus on the transatlantic slave trade, where blacks ended up slaves here in the United States, right? But they need to go in greater detail and let kids know that all people were slaves throughout history. White people were slaves for hundreds of years throughout history. They implant that in our mind here to implant an inferiority complex in us, a subservient position, to look at other people as they have one up on us or they owned us. When even during that time of slavery, most white people did not own slaves. Slaves were not cheap, And Asians, West Asians owned white people. North Africans, Arabs owned white people throughout history. If you don't believe me, just Google, were white people slaves? I don't get why our education focuses on black people being slaves. If we're going to do that, everybody need to focus on when they were slaves. Asians were slaves throughout history. Spanish people had slaves. Black people owned slaves. Black people were slaves at time. We need to let our kids know early, these new generations, to never identify with slavery. I do not identify with slavery. I wasn't a slave. I would never be a slave. I had ancestors who were slaves. And it's unfortunate what they went through, but this is a different time. We learn from the past. We focus on the present, and we headed towards the future. Train these new generations, young, kindergarten, pre-K, start teaching them about African history, pre-slavery, because they like to start there with us in slavery. My daughter came home telling me that white people hate us when I've experienced most of the deceit, most of the backstabbing, most of the hate and jealousy and envy from my own people. And I know that there's institutionalized racism, but I'm teaching my kids to watch out for everybody, because you can't trust most black people either. But for us to restore ourselves to a point where we have integrity and respect one another, we need to know our true history too. And it doesn't start with slavery. They're teaching your kids that another group of people just owned them and that's where they started. And that's not true. That's not true, because those people, many different types of white people, were slaves. They were slaves. And all a slave is somebody who is forced to do labor or provide some type of service to another person without pay. There's still millions of slaves, 40 million plus slaves in the world today. And it doesn't focus on race. Like we got to get to a point where we overcome race. It's stifling. I'm proud to be black, but that's one aspect of my life. Trust me, I'm a multi-dimensional being. And y'all need to catch when this system start implanting seeds of inferiority in your kids. And one of those major things is slavery. They have your kids thinking like somebody's better than them, or they need to gain acceptance from another group, and you don't. You don't. The average white person not worried about you. You need to figure out how to maneuver around the system. Trust me, the average white person don't care. And not in a bad way. It's just like the average black person don't care what's going on in your life. I done interacted with many different types of people, and there's good and there's bad people in every single group. There's people who think on a higher level, and there's people who think on a lower level. But all of that slavery stuff, don't let your kids identify with slavery. It is a bad, bad thing. When they learn about slavery, teach them a broad history about when there were Arab slaves, about when there were white slaves, Asian slaves, Christian slaves, how people become slaves from debt, from war, right? From imprisonment, human trafficking. Don't let your kids focus on the transatlantic slave trade and get their mind working where they're so focused on race and all of that, because it's so much to being a person than just race, than slavery. Think about the world when we get to a point where we move past all of this. And it's not going to happen right now because people think you crazy when you talk like this, because everybody thinking inside the box. My daughter, 6 years old, already coming home talking about white people owning black people and hate. If your kid's in public school, it's up to you to really educate your kids, man. Because even the teachers who are conscious, they have a curriculum to stick to. They're almost forced to teach certain things in a certain way. And it limits their creativity. And it limits the truth. So just be aware of all things. Learn your real history. Learn about different slavery and different groups. And be able to educate your kids and yourself. Because this world ain't what we think it is. We focus on what bad happened to bad people. And when another group, dominated us or whatever. But we don't get the full experience unless you were there. That's just like right now. We got cameras and everything. But we can't capture the full experience of right now unless we live in it, right? What if 10 million years from now, whoever here find bones from a basketball team that crashed in the ocean? Their study is going to conclude that the average person was 6'7". And that's going to be inaccurate, right? Because you're looking at history through a small lens. Stuff is not like what they tell us it is. It's not. There were black people already here before slavery. There were black people who owned slaves. There were black people who owned black slaves. There were black people who owned white people in other parts of the world. Like, y'all people got to get y'all mind right. Y'all got to stop thinking inside of the box all of the time. Y'all got to, dude, these people tell y'all anything and y'all just run with it. They tell you black people test lower than white people. But they don't tell you the part where if you control for the parents' socioeconomic status, black people test higher than white people and up the part and even higher than Asians in a lot of subjects. They don't tell you that type of stuff when they control for parent education, parent income, when black people at an equal playing field. Like, and I'm so much above all of that stuff, but you can do anything you want to with statistics and history. History, statistics, they can twist them any way they want to, trust me. Just history and statistics, you cannot trust them. So if they're going to tell a story, let them tell the whole story. Educate your kids because nobody else is. Do not let them put your kids' mind in a subservient position. That's a bad way to start off. I looked my daughter in the eyes, and the first thing I told her was, don't think about hate. Black people great. Everybody else do their thing too. They good, they okay. But one thing you need to know about you is that black people, they're great. We great. I said, baby, tell them we great. Say you great and mean it. And she said, we great.